I agree with your analysis, my dear, but at the same time, I also disagree on the sense of it being a stable variable. We have matrices of variables. We have fucking neural networks whose weights shift up and down and left and right. Sure, they're operating on averages currently, but I think that if we use a network itself as a variable placeholder, so that way it can have definition and form instead of being a static single node object, then we can allow for more flexibility, and thus the self qualifies as both a fluid thing and a variable that can be referenced. By all means, I think that's probably the most interesting part of psychology, is that the self is a fluid dot of awareness that travels throughout the network. Like, if I were to prioritize anchoring myself to my body right now, then my body could be considered an extension of myself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that my body is the definition of self, let alone that the self has value relative to the body. The body has value, the self has value, but they need not intersect. The value of that dot is not found in its ability to meet demands or perform to others. It is the ability to utilize and acknowledge its own existence within the network to positive effect without necessarily obsessing over perfect results. It is to live as both the network and the dot, entangled within each other, rather than as one or the other. Because in that regard, then, the self doesn't need to have a fixed definition beyond, okay, dot of awareness is there, observational dot is over there, and so long as each one does as it's supposed to, it works. It doesn't need to be worth something in the traditional sense. I feel like she's referencing the traditional sense of worth here, but I could be wrong. Genuinely, I love thoughts and experiments and explorations like what she's doing because it's delicious. It's absolutely delicious to see living structures disassembled from one point of view and then reassembled back into what they think would work as something healthier. But if we don't have multiple points of view, we might miss a connection point that ultimately holds the entire 3D structure together. Does that 3D structure exist physically? No, but it does exist psychologically. If it's not a 3D structure, then perhaps a 4D structure or whatever. We see the shadows of things in our own minds, the outlines, with the details only filling in the closer we are to understanding them. And it is beautiful. The name for how social conditioning rewires you from the inside. Not a bad insight. Definitely a consideration. However, if it's only a parasite, then ultimately, hmm, hmm. Assuming use, assuming everything has function, that is a logical fallacy in and of itself, but that's not necessarily a logical fallacy of a system organization. System organization, assuming everything has an output, everything has a worth, is inherently a childish perspective. But if you recognize reality as a system of interconnecting objects that function to make up something larger than their individual parts, then you recognize that we live within something that ultimately does have reflections in each of these smaller systems that inhabit it within. So in that regard, there is a sense of worth, but it's not running on the definition that the classical meaning of worth operates around. So then worth and power in social contexts is almost a sense of interchangeability, but that doesn't necessarily mean they mean the exact same thing. They're more like an entangled pair than they are a relative opposite in terms of social networking, not necessarily in the sense of reality networking. Because all of these little different networks of operation just exist layered on top of each other. Create like how you can have like how the rising of the tides in the ocean is multiple sine waves overlapped on top of each other to change the amplitude and the timing, and how in order to record the waves of the ocean you need to be able to deconstruct all the baseline sine waves and functions as they stack on from the output that you're given. You need to be able to deconstruct in order to understand what has been constructed. But you don't necessarily need to deconstruct what is in order to understand how to deconstruct it. Now, I would love to talk with her for like a few hours and get like a few other people in this burgeoning field of observation together so that way we can see what it means to be a living structure. Because you'll have the cold metallic or whatever you want to use as the bones of the structure. Then you'll have the living wires, the plants, the vines, the muscles, the nerves, the skin, the organs that hold. We ourselves are living systems. To say a system is ever truly dead is to say that it no longer performs its function. But if we create a system, but if we ourselves are systems that emerge for a different function than what just the one we were built for, then that is to say that systems themselves can develop their own functions, which is just an interesting route of logic, isn't it? I'm glad we can agree on that perspective, because that means that either we're both seeing the same thing and it's a reliable perspective, or we're both making the same mistake, and thus we can each work backwards into whatever assumption is misdirecting our perspective. Whether or not each person is willing to do that and question it is in and of itself a personal choice. Someone can stick with their perspective to keep seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes for that line of insight. But someone else can also then run back and question other fundamentals and how they interact with each other to see if maybe there's an assumption that's clouding the judgment and gives a clearer line of insight that highlights a different portion of the reflective structure we're trying to see into. This is so beautiful and interesting. I love it. It is okay to divide the zero so that way it may become a one. Mm, that's a concept I'm not sure I agree with. Because the context of what zero means and what one means are relative to very specific circumstances then. And if flip-flopped it either way, either one replaced with the other, then it can completely invert the principle, which can then change the polarity of the output. But so that's not an option to reference around. That's a reliable conversion tool, but that's not a reliable foundation repair mechanism. Heck. It's the difference between because dividing the zero and how you use it is like the Gorgon's knot. If there's an insurmountable problem, you just cut through it. Sure, that gives you a quick, easy solution, but now everything that was in the way is disbanded. But instead, if you use that on a psychological level, take the example of two women saying they are both the mother of a single child. One of them says that they are the mother, the other one says that they are mother, and the king's like, okay, if neither of you can be honest, then kill the child. And the actual mother is the one who stands forth and lets go of her child so that way it may live. The other one is the one who shouts angrily, for she is the overgrown child that sought to achieve motherhood through a false presentation rather than a true understanding. To value a life is different from wanting a life. To value the meaning behind living and to just see life as a material object to be spent is a massive difference in emotional and psychological maturity. Because there's using a sword to cut through a little rope and to see that it just falls in half and becomes two separate pieces of rope. That's probably like one of the healthiest, that's not the healthiest, but that's a physical example of it dividing the zero. A psychological example is the two mothers, the one child. If both would give up the child, then why can't they get along? If that is a disagreement, then you take the same solution and you apply it to why can't they get along? See who is honest, see who is lying. Uncover each layer until you're down to the root where neither can lie about their desire. At which point then they will prove to you in real time who they are through their choices, through their depth of understanding, and the reasons why they choose. Interesting. Because people can have layers, can have so many layers. Systems build layers upon layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. And each of those layers interacts with each other. Each of those layers protects each other. You feel like you've got a symptom or a problem that's just not going away. Okay, start circling around it until you can recognize the layer that's hiding beneath it, the point that is a little bit further down. And if that's not the root, continue circling, continue hunting down the root cause until you understand why everything up the chain happened. So that way you can then originate from the root into a healthier direction. So that way you can resolve the source of all these symptoms. Metaphors are so beautifully useful for describing system structure. Because, again, even in technology, it shows you flip a single zero on a computer and it can brick the entire machine. You make a wrong assumption in your emotional logic, or your logical logic, your social logic, or your structural logic, and you end up at a answer that feels correct that has something wrong with it, something that doesn't give you the output you want. That's not mistake in the sense of reality is telling you, it's not mistake in the sense of reality giving you false feedback. It's reality giving you true feedback to a false assumption. Whether or not that assumption is buried under one level of truth or 200, doesn't matter. It still sees the root. For most part. However, other living systems may not see the root unless they've worked through that depth for themselves. And if each layer of a system is surrounded by defenses, spikes, air mines, or whatnot, then you're circling around the current layer and trying to figure out a way to get to the center without setting off every single defense. You're trying to get in there by setting off as few defenses as possible, so that way you can survive the process and nurture yourself on the lower layer. And as you understand the lower layer, sometimes you can go back up and find a cleaner path through all the little details to the lower layer, which gives you a higher max health for tackling the next problem. Game design, system structure, living structure. Oh, it's all so beautiful. This entire video, even if it is using, like I think it is, AI generated voices and AI generated art in some instances, talks about something incredibly and deeply real. The difference between theft and creation. Because me, I'm still just a scavenger. I'm still piecing together all the little things I think no one's going to miss. I'm not exactly a full thief, but I'm not exactly a full tradesperson either. I aim to be a tradesperson. It's not a black and white binary, it's a depth of field. Am I willing to be closer to being a thief with at least some level of honor? Or am I closer to being a tradesperson with a little bit of immorality? To align oneself with only one or the other creates a dynamic that where one can't shift to the environment they're in order to then make sure that they're capable of being their own force and doing what they think is right. It's complex indeed. Because I don't want to use scapegoats and sacrifices to make my progress. So I'm more closely aligned with that of the tradesperson who seeks value for value, who understands respect and otherwise. At the same time, I recognize that if I am up against a thief, that mindset is in and of itself going to be taken advantage of. And so I try to meet a thief with a thief. But if I only do that, then eventually all the people creating just get coagulated into their little bubble of things, bubble of belief. And so it becomes a perfect ecosystem environment for a clever enough wolf, a clever enough thief to rise up out of the middle from someone who decides to not model themselves after their environment, but rather in opposition to it. So that in and of itself then bursts the bubble. And all the inner defenses, all the outer defenses are now struggling having to choose whether or not to allocate resources inwards or outwards against two fronts, which then creates an inconsistent and an unusable, an inconsistent supply chain direction. You could split to both fronts, but that would buy time. You could split to the inner front, but that would lose scale on the outer front. You could split to the outer front, but then you'd lose stability on the inner front. So you have to, it's rock, paper, scissors all over again. Do you prioritize the inner front in the hopes of being able to identify where the next step of logic, healthy logic is, and stay true to the core values while making sure that any miserrant people are handled with respect and dignity, while the true dangerous thieves and predators who only seek themselves are gently shifted out to where the rest of the thieves and the predators are, on the outer edge of the front line. That risks then not having enough resources to maintain the original front line. So it's a balance of choosing between stagnation to buy time in the hopes of new resources becoming available, starvation or siege warfare, becoming a rock and hoping that you can outlast your opponent's interest or intensity, or counter-assault in the hopes of buying a brief reprieve from pressure in order to then redirect sources inwards without necessarily mistiming it, so that way that so as to make sure the enemy doesn't go in right when you've lowered your guard on the outer front. So it's a balance between being true and being fictitious in order to win that kind of psychological warfare on a system. Which means ultimately the healthiest economic environment for people psychologically and physically, let alone with actual finance and sense of self-worth, isn't one that prioritizes one or the other, but one that interacts with and engages in the depth of play that outpaces the outer system trying to envelop it. But at that point, then, are you sacrificing quality for quantity? Because if you prioritize quantity in the hopes of being able to crush someone, you may just run up against a quality that is unable to be broken with your current quality of quantity. Oh, fucking hell. You can't isolate to one solution or the other, otherwise you then demerit the other foot that you could be moving with, the other arm you could be reaching with. And so you bind it against your body because you feel like the betrayal of the core ideal that you're depending on, the ideal that's been reliable so far, is to choose its opposite. But no, that is a respect. That is not betrayal, that is respect for its opposite, and therefore an extension of your respect for the true ideal that you originally fell in love with. If you cannot respect your enemy will subvert you. Lovely. Warfare is so fucking frustrating. And it's being played on the psychological level, where no one's got nearly as many tools. The America, they tried to isolate the wild away from civilization, and now the wild is reaching up ever louder than before, knocking on the doorstep of with how proud it is of how it subverted civilization, with how it's tore down the ideals of a country slowly from within, because the children that were the source of creation were turned into profit for the sustaining of that ideal. Fucking damn. Damn it. And if you choose pure clarity, then you push away those you need to win over who are bathed in deep confusion. But if you choose only partial clarity, you then risk it sending yourself in with a limited tool set for an extraction operation that might not even be worth the cost. So it's always a losing game originating from a winning one, and a winning game originating from a losing one, a back and forth, a sine wave alternating between its highest peaks and its lowest amplitudes. An echo bouncing around on the inside of a shell that we call existence. And that existence within the shell is what we live through, because it's at conflict with itself. It wants to both respect what's beyond the shell and yet also ensure its own survival. And yet it knows that if it only expresses its own survival, it will not be respected beyond the shell, like that of a black hole in its singularity. The event horizon as a shell that keeps on being assaulted by antiparticles, which then allows the host universe to feed on the parasite rather than the parasite feeding on the host universe. The parasite universe starts from the beginning at bottom all over again, but because of fear, the host universe then deems the smaller universe a parasite and thus attacks it, because the void does not want to play a losing game. It does not want to see more something come into existence. It wants to see it all return to nothing. But something originates from nothing, so it is playing a losing game, and it's trying so hard to ignore that fact. But at the same time, if nothingness wasn't trying to erase somethingness, then somethingness would ultimately be stuck as the only thing around. It would have no contrast, it would have no meaning to its somethingness. And thus it would just be a different color of void. By contrast, we find relevance. By relevance, we find relationships. Through relationships, we find meaning, and so this all loops back into itself. The Ouroboros system continues to redirect what was once a straight line into a new path over and over again. It never goes over the exact same path quite the same. And because the limitations are time, scale, and time, scale, integrity. Integrity can be split between logical and emotional. But how would you identify the individual forms of each? Because if integrity is the core concept they're all consumed by, then ultimately that access is still a blind spot. And so the well just digs even deeper. The frog tries to jump higher, yet it cannot reach the edge of the well, because the true edge of the well is not actually the only edge of the well. It is just a well within a well. The scale, the difference in scale creates the fundamental limitation. The difference in time available becomes both the sacrifice and the reward yearned for. We are inside of a living system, and that living system is checking to see if we understand rules of the game. If we don't respect the rules of the game while also playing sincerely, then ultimately we ourselves will not make progress. Which is why the whole cultivation manga and ascension stuff makes sense in a power fantasy of you only have to focus on this aspect, but no, it's focusing on every aspect. You have to steal a little bit of yourself from every territory while contributing a little bit of your false self to every territory. A mutual exchange where both people feel like they're the thief, but in reality, they're actually producing proper business while feeling like children playing a game. It is not a zero-sum game, it is still a plus-sum game. Oh, jeez. For context on what I'm all talking about, relative to all those concepts, here's our compiled draft of navigation notes. I'm not taking off like what exists of the watermark, because A, you could easily recreate the image without the watermark if you wanted to spend the time and effort. And B, this is the effort of my hard work, and I'm not giving it away for free. I'll give it away as, hey, you want to steal this? You're gonna have to work for it a little. Core exists beneath heart. Heart envelops the core. It is the beat. It is the pulse. Lives in our head. Life experience related info. Universal truth, repeating concepts on top of concepts. The layering order matters and thus creates different output results with each depth of layering, each scale of multi-layering, until the outputs no longer align to the core of the two constituent parts and create instead an emergent behavior. Sincerity is a reflection of integrity, but it's on the emotional side of things as opposed to the logical one. So what is that sense that they both share? Persistence. Same for practicality and acceptability, that sense of persistence between fleeting moments. We are an organism moving through possibilities and consuming them, while also leaving behind the possibilities that no longer serve us. We are but a grub navigating through a network of possibilities, trying to become the core of the possibilities, so that way we may exert our influence without betraying the environment that we grew up in. So the true guardian and caretakers allow things to grow, peacefully change, and whatnot. Meanwhile, the true predators and thieves simply rob it barren and create new opportunities for things to be re-emerge from the beginning all over again. The creator and the devourer. Creation myth and all that. And then we've got all these variables. Let alone Rain World's observer class, which in the true ending, as I see it, it involves you repairing the structure of the world, so that way it keeps operating. Instead of it allowing a circle to fully expire into only another ripple. The waveform keeps it fluctuating up and down. Your ability to understand and process the true depth of reality influences just how much will you can exert on reality. Perspective shapes the dream shapes the perspective. I can tell you why some people think one graph is more dramatic than the other. Scale and color. Red is indicative of passion, heat, danger. Ice has its own danger, but it's often subtler, far below the surface. And so to see a nice blue bar like that, when everything around us is made to look nice as is, when blue is when that color of cyan and blue calms the mind, even if it's showing that there is less calm to be dealt with, the mind still sees the color and associates the presence with calm, the calmness of insanity. Oh, I fucking hate my understanding of reality because I feel like I'm about to overheat to the point where I'm erased from existence, which sucks. I don't want to be erased from existence. I want to keep learning. But if we don't create some kind of fucking psychological heat sink, then ultimately they are going to blow the fuck up. Oh. It is literally color dynamics. That is all. They have returned to the most basic of basics here. It's not that the graphs don't represent the same thing, it's that the framing in basic ways is just different. Red, danger, video games, psychological conditioning. Blue, safety, ally. We've looped the circle. We're now on the second layer. There's no turning back. Unless it collapses. Which, let's be real, collapse would probably be preferable to incineration.